To get started, for those who don't know, Helena Hunters and Anglers Association is a local nonprofit group of natural resource professionals who advocate for functional ecosystem conservation and wildlife habitat preservation on public land in the Helena area and along the Continental Divide. We also advocate for ethical hunting and wildlife and natural resource education. Shannon Hilty is our speaker, who's generously agreed to join us. Shannon is the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks non-game biologist for Region 4 out of Great Falls. Before that, she worked as a wildlife biologist here in Helena, and she received her master's degree in fish and wildlife management from MSU. She is here to tell us a little bit about conservation issues that face bats in Montana and some of the projects that FWP is working on to help bats. So without any further introduction, I will hand over host controls to Shannon and she can take it away. Just 1 second and I'll turn off my video.
Okay, thanks, Cami. Looks like we've got Steve and Arnella on, so welcome. It's going to be a private presentation for you two.
Yeah, so I think you're a host now, Shannon. So
awesome.
There are two of us here with Steve, so
awesome.
Got one more.
Well, great. All right, are you guys seeing my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay. You guys still there?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right, well, let's get started then. All right, so hi everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me tonight. I am always really excited to chat about bats and tell you some of the cool projects that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has been working on recently. You know, when Cami told me, do you want to come chat bats with hunters and anglers? I was pretty excited to hear that, you know, a special interest group was interested in these smaller species. And I often get asked, you know, how can I help bats? And the answer is really pretty simple. Just do exactly what you guys are doing here tonight and just learn more. You know, there's a lot of myths circulating around, and if you can help stop spread misinformation by being educated, I think that's a huge win. So I'm going to throw a lot at you. I'm kind of keeping it broad. I'm going to talk about the importance of bats, and then I'm going to follow that by talking about some of the most notable conservation threats. And I'm going to wrap it up by talking about just a few of the ongoing Fish, Wildlife, and Parks projects aimed at addressing some of these conservation threats. So there are a lot of details that I don't have time to go into, but you know, there's plenty of time afterwards for questions if anyone has any. Okay, so bats are incredibly important, believe it or not. They serve, you know, integral roles in biodiversity, ecosystem health, and ultimately the economy. They do things like pollinate plants and disperse seeds. So there are over 300 fruit-producing species that depend primarily on bats for pollination. That includes some species of mangoes, cashews, and figs, so things that some of you might like to eat. But there are other plants that we call Chiroptophilus, which essentially is just a fancy word that means they have evolved to actually be pollinated by bats. So if you think about agave, which is the genus of plant from which tequila is produced, that's a great example of this. You know, you look at the plant parts and you can kind of see how that might have evolved to be pollinated by some of these long-tongued bats. Most species of bats in the United States also eat insect pests, and those might be pests that feed on humans and livestock, might be pests that cause forest disease or eat crops. You know, I don't like mosquitoes. Chances are you don't either. And estimates definitely vary by species, but a single bat can consume anywhere from 1,600 to 6,000 insects within a single evening. So that's a lot of mosquitoes potentially. So that's important. And on top of that, they have like a monetary value as well. You know, they save the worldwide agriculture industry an estimated $3.7 billion annually by just providing things like free pest control. So, you know, there are vineyards in California and Washington that are putting up bat boxes just to kind of try and, you know, use these animals for free pest control, essentially. And then they also provide food for other species. So, for example, you know, this is just one picture of a snake-eating bat, but there are 20 different snake species that enter caves to just feed on bats. So lots of important ecosystem roles. There are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide, which means that basically 1 in 4 mammal species is a bat. The only group of mammals that has more species is rodents. So that kind of also indicates, you know, their role in biodiversity. They are everywhere. We can find them in pretty much every landscape except maybe extreme deserts and maybe polar regions. But that means that, you know, they're likely in your neighborhood, if not in your backyard. And you might be thinking, cool, you know, we just have one species in Montana though, and it's little and it's brown and it flies around my head at night very erratically. But I'm here to tell you that we actually have 15 species in Montana, and they're actually pretty diverse. So all of these species are insectivores. The pallid bat up here in the top left corner, this species can also sip nectar, but it really only does that in the Southwest. Another cool fact about this particular bat, it lands on the ground and actually runs after its prey on its, I guess it would be its wrists. So that's pretty cool. The Townsend's big-eared bat is kind of evolved to, you know, live in caves and now mines. So it's a really cute bat that we have in Montana. Big brown bat. This is my least favorite bat to capture. Honestly, this species has so they can chomp on that chitin and chew up beetles. So they bite really hard, and bats, I've never seen one in really tall limestone cliffs, and they fly really high and they're just really hard to capture. But we do record them on acoustic bat detectors, and so we know that we have them in Montana, and we kind of have an idea of like where they are. Actually, down there in Helena, Gates of the Mountains, that's a great spot for spotted bats. And you might notice these like massive ears that they have. They can actually roll those up for thermal regulation to, you know, get rid of hot and cold. Then we have the silver-haired bat, the eastern red bat, and the hoary bat. These 3 species are what we call the migratory tree roosting species. So they migrate, and as the name suggests, they roost mostly in trees, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. And then we have 7 species, these little guys right here, that are belonging to the genus Myotis. And these are kind of what people think of when people think about bats kind of flying erratically at night. But they're all characteristics. So lots of bats in Montana. But this is when we get to the bummer part of the talk. You know, globally and in Montana, bats face a wide array of conservation issues, including things like loss of foraging and roosting habitat and habitat fragmentation. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail there. I think you're all pretty aware of what's going on there. But, you know, we have started to focus on these 2 I guess, newer threats, what we kind of are thinking are unprecedented threats, white nose syndrome and wind energy development. So all of these threats and our ability to kind of manage adaptively in response to these threats are further compounded by just an overall lack of baseline information on things like habitat use, distribution, and abundance. Bats are really hard to study. You know, they're tiny, at least in the US, they're tiny. They fly, they're nocturnal. So unless you're a night owl like myself, not so fun to, work with. They live in fairly inaccessible places, like the spotted bat and the cliffs. So there's just a lot that we don't know about these species. Bat fatalities at wind energy facilities are widespread. We know that tons of bats are dying. Estimates are kind of hard to get at, but one that I see repeatedly quoted is this Smallwood paper. So an estimate in 2012 showed that 888,000 fatalities occurred in just 2012 alone. And 75% of the fatalities that we're seeing at these facilities are migratory tree roosting bats. So again, this is the hoary bat, the eastern red bat, and the silver-haired bat, three of the biggest bats that we have in Montana. So we're not exactly sure what's going on here. It looks like the turbines might interfere with mating and migrating. They mate and migrate in the late summer and autumn, and that's kind of when we're seeing the most fatalities. And lots of theories. I think like one of the leading theories is that bats think the turbine blades or maybe the entire structure is like a giant tree or like a lek type feature. And so they fly in to check it out and die that way, but we're not really sure. In addition to these three migratory species, we have 4 additional species that have suffered fatalities due to wind energy. Then, of course, this other really large threat that we're seeing now is white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is a disease that's caused by the cold-adapted fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or PD for short. And so this fungus severely infects the skin tissues of hibernating bats. In severe cases, as you can see here, it actually looks like white fuzz on the muzzle and wings. And so essentially what happens is this fungus eats through the skin tissue of the bat while it's hibernating. And as you can imagine, that's super painful. And so they wake up periodically throughout hibernation. And that's just a really energetically expensive thing to do. And a lot of the times they're not able to recoup those energy losses. And so they starve to death and die. And when it first was detected over in New York, researchers entering caves were just entering caves just with piles of dead bats. So it was a big deal, and it still is. So white nose syndrome was detected in New York over here, this red X, in 2006. And since then, as you can follow this color map, it's spread westward. It kind of jumped the Midwest and Western states. And we now have it over in Washington and California. But, since 2006, millions of fatalities have been recorded. A recent paper estimated that white nose syndrome has caused population declines in over 90%, over 90% in 3 of the really most common bat species in the East Coast. And one of those species is little brown myotis that we have over here. So as wind energy development and white nose syndrome kind of increase in prevalence in the West, the effects of all of these, threats are kind of compounded by this overall lack of just information on baseline things like distribution, abundance, and natural history even. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like for Montana species, again, so we have the 3 migratory tree roosting bats. These 3 are the ones that are most commonly seen or documented as fatalities at wind energy facilities. We have 7 species that have been recorded with diagnostic symptoms of white nose syndrome outside of the state, so not necessarily in Montana. But we know that these species are susceptible to white nose syndrome. And then there are 4 additional species that have been documented as PD positive. So they have the fungus, but they're not showing signs of white nose syndrome. And then when we look at all of these species, all of these species are facing things like habitat loss and fragmentation. And again, just that general lack of baseline information. So these are things that are very concerning to fish life in parks. All right, so we know that bats are important, and we know that bats in Montana are facing several large conservation threats, including habitat loss, wind energy, and white nose syndrome. And that these threats are just further compounded by just these big knowledge gaps. So at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, we're really trying to address these larger threats while at the same time trying to learn more about the things that we don't know and address those knowledge gaps so that we can make informed management decisions to help these groups of animals. So I am going to talk about just big picture overview of 3 projects pertaining to these threats and or knowledge gaps. I'm going to start with a project that's near and dear to me. This was my master's project on habitat selection in lodgepole forests. I have actual results for this, so that's probably why I'm going to spend the most time on it. But I also want to touch on the white nose syndrome efforts that we are doing right now, as well as something called North American bat monitoring. That's a pretty cool project, so I at least want to bring that up. So again, this first project was my master's project that I conducted at MSU, but in tandem with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so kind of like the original conversation, you know, we know that roosts are important to bats. There's been a ton of studies out in the East Coast and in the Southwest even, and so that we know that these features are really important. Bats spend a large percentage of their lives using these features. You know, roosts provide things like protection from predators and weather, as well as a place to socialize, rear pups, develop sperm, and even hibernate. So bats require different types of roost sites to complete their life history. And these sites really vary by species, by sex, by reproductive condition, and then even by time of year. So it is like a very complex thing, but they are like very important to the group. So bats, they spend a lot of time at what we call day roosts during the active season. When I say active season, in Montana, that generally means late April through October. We're kind of trying to narrow that down a little bit, but that's essentially when bats are not hibernating, right? And so they are spending time in what we call day roost during this period. And that's where they're resting during the day and they're evading predators. And so, you know, we think that quality and also just basic availability of roosts might actually limit the distribution and abundance of bats, which really makes these sites key for conservation. In order for, you know, managers to effectively manage a landscape in a way that's going to be beneficial for bats, especially with the increasing prevalence of, you know, things like white nose syndrome and wind energy development, we really have to understand, you know, which characteristics of these roosts are important. And although bat roosts have been well studied in the eastern United States, we know a lot less about them in the West. We have species, a lot of species that they have out east. So for example, the little brown myotis. And certainly those species have been studied a lot out east. But if you look at the topography and just the landscape in the West, the Rocky Mountains, you know, we have a lot of exposed rock. And so we think there's a potential for bats out here to be maybe doing different things than they're doing out east. So given that we know roosting sites might limit the distribution and abundance of bat populations, and that information regarding these features is limited, we aimed to first quantify characteristics of roosts used by male bats in lodgepole forests during the summer. But we wanted to take that step further and examine roost selection in more detail using models to assess preferences. So like whether bats are selecting certain characteristics disproportionately to what's actually available to them in the forest. You know, what do they prefer? And so because bats can fly, you know, they're able to perceive these different resources at different spatial scales within a short amount of time, you know, generally within a single evening. So if you think about a bat, it's going to wake up around, you know, right before sunset. It's probably going to fly out and drink, and then it's going to eat for a few hours. And as it's flying around, I mean, just, I guess it's, picture this landscape in the background. It's flying around, it's seeing this landscape at a very large scale perspective. But at some point, it's going to get tired and it's going to want to retire for the night. And it needs to make some decisions, right? So it might key in on like this patch of trees over here. And then once it gets to the patch of trees, it needs to decide, all right, where am I actually going to roost? You know, which tree am I going to roost in? Which particular feature am I going to use? A woodpecker cavity? Am I going to roost in a crack? Those are decisions that they have to make. And then all of these different decisions that they're making kind of come together. These characteristics come together to create what we call the microclimate of the roost. And when I say microclimate, I really mean temperature and humidity. And we know that temperature and humidity are really important to bats. So to address these two questions, we worked in two different places. So the Little Bat Mountains, just kind of north of White Sulphur Springs. This was up in the Moose Creek area for some of you that are more familiar with this area. And then over in the Boulder Mountains, just west of Helena, over the pass there. So these areas are very similar in topography. I took both of these photos so you can see, you know, they're kind of like rolling hills and then lodgepole pine dominated that have been hit by varying degrees of mountain pine beetle severity. So snags are really abundant in both landscapes, as you can see in these photos. And we do know that, you know, sometimes bats like to roost in trees. So we wanted a study area where these features were at least available so we could assess those preferences. We then misnetted for bats. It's a very hard thing to photograph. I was hoping I could talk somebody into coming out with me next time to take pictures, but you know, you can kind of see one of the misnet poles here. And what we do is we set up two poles and then we stretch something called a misnet in between the two poles. And when we unfurl it, you know, it's difficult. It's a fine mesh material. And essentially they fly in and, you know, hopefully they're distracted by foraging or drinking and then they hit the net and we can take them out. And then we fit male little brown myotis with radio transmitters. So as you can see in this picture, this species is very small. You know, I would guess that this particular bat was maybe 5.5 grams and that radio transmitter is 0.26 grams. So very small technology. And we chose to work with little brown myotis because they used to be one of the most common species in North America. And, you know, they've just been completely decimated by white nose syndrome. It's very likely that they're going to be federally listed under the Endangered Species Act in the next few years. So that's going to have huge implications for Montana. And it's also a species of concern within the state. We then let the bats go of hide and seek, where essentially ran all around and tracked the bats.
My niece giving a lecture to everybody in Montana.
I'm gonna mute whoever is unmuted. There we go. Track the bats to their roosts. You can see the little bat right here. And then we selected a randomly available roost for each roost that we located. And this paired use availability design is what was going to allow us to investigate whether bats were selecting for certain rock characteristics disproportionately to what was available to them. And then at each roost and available random roost, we recorded habitat characteristics. Again, we were interested in those different spatial scales, so landscape, plot, the actual roost, and then the microclimate. We deployed these little eye buttons. You can see they're teeny tiny and shove them into the rocks to measure the temperature and humidity for a few days. Pretty handy little things. So big picture, when we were looking at our bat captures, all captures were male skewed. 95% of the little brown myotis that we captured over the 2 summers were males. We ended up tagging 34 males and we found at least one roost for 20 of those individuals. And so, you know, I know this is a group of hunters and anglers, so maybe you have elk biologists and big game biologists talk to you, and you know, elk, they get these giant collars with just huge, powerful signals. It's not the case in bats. You know, in a flat landscape, you're lucky if you can pick your bat up at 1 kilometer away. And so when you add rocks into that mix, it's just a really hard game of hide and seek. So I think we did pretty well on this front. It's pretty similar to other projects. And then for those 20 individuals, we found 57 roosts total. And although snags were available on the landscape, they were selecting rocks. You know, 86% were roosting in rock features. We did have 2 individuals that used both rocks and trees, 2 individuals that used only trees, 15 that used only rocks. And so given that so few roosts were actually in trees, we focused on rock roosting bats, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. Just to give you an idea of what these roosts look like on the landscape, here's a panoramic picture. This is a site outside of the Boulder Mountains. Just to give you an idea of scale, this particular arrow, the one on the very right, is about 2¼ kilometers away from the talus slope in the foreground. And this particular individual, when switching. And this is something that, you know, you see in a lot of different studies. And we think they do it because, well, for various reasons. One, because they need different microclimate requirements, I guess, depending on, you know, the ambient temperatures or what's going on locally. But it also helps them evade predators. So that wasn't super surprising. What was kind of surprising is that they came back and reused the same exact roost multiple times. That hasn't been documented very often. So they were using crevices more than rock cavities. So crevices being like actual cracks in the rock versus, you know, I guess we define cavities as 3 or more rocks coming together to kind of form a hole. And within those crevice features, they were choosing these vertical crevices over horizontal or diagonal crevices. And so if you think about, you know, the sun moving across this landscape, if a bat is roosting in this vertical crevice, it can really move up and down throughout the day to thermoregulate depending on what the ambient temperatures are doing. But if you think about a horizontal crevice, that's kind of the same microclimate throughout. So that's why we think maybe they were choosing these particular features over the others. And 85% of the time, I mean, we could just walk up, and once we got good at finding bats, we would just see them. So these are some good pictures of that. You can't see them here, but here's a close-up of that particular bat. And the 2 photos on the right, you know, you can see these bats, they're just sunning themselves. And so another feature that we thought was important was having access to this kind of skyward facing crevice, because it did allow them to just sun themselves essentially. So big picture, just model results. I won't get into the stats. I won't bore you with that, but big picture things, we did find that bats were selecting roosts that were closer to water. They were also selecting roosts that were in larger talus slopes. And that kind of makes sense if you think about, you know, a bat roosting in the middle of a large talus slope. It's probably going to have less canopy cover, so it might mean more you know, heat from the sun. And also larger talus slope might mean, you know, more roosting options, just kind of what we were thinking there. They were also selecting roosts that were essentially wider with less canopy cover and had access to that skyward facing crevice. So again, we think all of these things have to do with the microclimate. And then when we looked at just the microclimate model, they were definitely selecting warmer roosts, which isn't that surprising. That's kind of what most studies have found. But kind of, you know, the more important fact is that we're kind of considering these things at different spatial scales. So it's really these landscape features coming together with these plot features, roost features to create that particular microclimate. So in terms of management, how do we have all of those things to help bats, you know, have these microclimates that they need? So when we take a step back and look at the whole picture, you know, we learned a lot of things. Bats in our study were preferentially choosing to roost in rocks, even though snags were abundant within our study area. So it's possible that lodgepole pine in this landscape doesn't provide appropriate roosting features for male little brown myotis. I'm not saying that they are not important. I think that they could have a lot of other implications, but we just weren't finding them in trees. We did observe, crevices and cavities from woodpeckers in lodgepole pine snags, but they were often just shallow or too small to be accessible to a little brown myotis. If you think about a ponderosa pine snag and a lodgepole, if you think about an older tree of both of those species, ponderosa, really large diameter. When that bark peels off, it's just super thick. Bats can just like hide under that and reap the microclimate benefits. Whereas a lodgepole, like you really have to work to pick off the flaky, bark from a lodgepole tree. So it's just very different. And even when it's still really thin. So it's like, centimeters, maybe millimeters thin compared to maybe a few inches in like a lodgepole, a ponderosa or a Doug fir. So that's kind of what we're thinking about there. We also found that bats were selecting features that created higher temperatures relative to other locations on the landscape. Bats like warm microclimates. We kind of already knew that, but it was, additional research within the state. And then again, we just considered these different spatial scales that contributed to creating this warm microclimate of the roost. The male skewed sex ratio thing was interesting. I mean, it makes sense. There have been a few other studies that have seen kind of this elevational gradient where you find females at lower elevations and males at higher elevations. And it makes sense, lodgepole forests they're higher and they're colder, they're less productive. So if you're a female with a pup and you're lactating, maybe you want to be somewhere down lower where insects are more readily available, temperatures are warmer. That it was still really interesting. It hasn't really been documented in lodgepole. So although we conducted this study in Montana, lodgepole exists throughout most of the Rocky Mountains. Talus features are abundant. So, these are likely important elsewhere outside of Montana. And this particular study was just on day roosts, but it got us thinking about transitional autumn roosts as well as winter hibernacula. Winter is really when white nose syndrome impacts hibernating bats. So out east, you have bats roosting colonially in caves or mines, and they're all kind of packed in there and they're getting hit hard by white nose syndrome. But if we have bats out here, maybe roosting solitarily in talus slopes or something like that, perhaps white nose syndrome won't be as bad. We don't know. I think the take home point here is this is kind of a starting point to start looking for winter hibernacula, and it's something that Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been working on for a few years. It's just really hard to figure out. But if they're using these features, we need to know, right? So we're in kind of the beginning stages of several projects on this front that's kind of coming out of this work. So I'm going to completely switch gears and talk quickly about white nose syndrome monitoring in Montana. So as a quick reminder, it was detected in New York and it's moved westwards, just totally decimating bats. Fish, Wildlife and Parks and also our partners developed a surveillance, prevention and response plan. I think in 2014, that was back when I was at the Montana Natural Heritage Program. So we knew it was coming and we have been trying to prepare for quite a while. And then in 2019, Fish, Wildlife and Parks and partners kind of began this multi-year project to conduct surveillance to establish both the timing of PD and white nose syndrome occurrence, but also the distribution. And this particular project is being led by Emily Almberg out of Bozeman, but it's been a huge agency-wide effort. So there were some preliminary monitoring efforts in 2020, but we really ramped up last year, or I guess this year, so that we can really understand the complete distribution of the fungus across the state. So we divided the state into these large cells and essentially tried to hit as many of them as possible so that they could track the spread and then also model, do predictive modeling to kind of see where it might be detected next. So white nose syndrome monitoring involves catching bats early in that active season. Again, Active season is like April through October, and we were kind of shooting for April through June, depending on where we were in the state. And then we would swab them on the wings with like a giant Q-tip or on the muzzle, and then collect guano and have all of that analyzed for PD. But then we also used a UV light to look for signs of white nose syndrome. So when you have a bat that's exhibiting that white fuzz or the fungus, and you put a UV light on it, it really fluoresces, so you can actually see it. And then of course, if there are like holes in the tissue, that's not a great sign. So that's kind of what we were looking for. We used a lot of different methods to capture bats. This is tricky. Early season catching bats is not an easy thing. So this involved going into caves where they were still hibernating, as well as mist netting. Here's a little bit better of a picture of a mist net. You can see me taking that bat out. But we also did things like this contraption. You know, we had to sample a bat box, and we were kind of thinking like, how do we get the bats out? So Ryan Rasher and I decided to make this weird little funnel situation that ended in a pillowcase to kind of try and get them out safely, because nets aren't necessarily the safest way to do that. And so, you know, I was a little bit worried they were all going to fall out at once, but it was really just one bat at a time, just slowly fluttering and screaming the whole way down into the pillowcase. And then we could safely remove it and swab it. But we had to get creative to kind of hit all of these different sites. And I will note that we did follow decontamination protocols designed by the National Wildlife Health Center during these efforts. And then we also, if you see us wearing masks in some of these pictures, this was, you know, these were COVID guidelines, so post pandemic, I guess, or during the pandemic. So again, this effort is set to continue for, I think, 5 more years. We have very preliminary results, but here is something Emily Almberg put together. So in 2020, that preliminary work detected PD in Richland County, which is way over here on the eastern border of Montana. And then in 2021, of course, we ramped up that effort. We detected PD in 8 counties. Those are all of the counties that are yellow with the red dots. And then in 2021, we also detected white nose syndrome. So bats that were exhibiting symptoms of white nose syndrome in 3 additional counties. And those are noted with the stripes here. So, you know, thankfully, Western Montana didn't have any positives. Nothing in my region came up positive, but that definitely doesn't mean that we don't have white nose syndrome, right? It just means that we did not detect it. I really expect this to change next year and, you know, in the coming years. So other big questions that we still need to address are things like, what impact is white nose syndrome going to have on our bat species? We have no clue. Losses in the state could be significant. You know, again, we don't entirely know for sure because we don't know where our bats are hibernating. There's currently no treatment to remove fungus from the environment or increase immunity in bats, can't treat sick bats. So once it's here, it's kind of here. So we have to kind of think about other questions like, can we put more effort into things that reduce other threats to bat population, like maybe habitat loss and wind energy development to kind of help mitigate these effects, since we can't do that much about white nose syndrome. So those are kind of the conversations we're having during this monitoring effort. Then I'm going to switch gears one more time to help us assess the impacts of white nose syndrome, wind energy development, habitat loss, all of that stuff. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks and our partners are working with something called the North American Bat Monitoring Program, or NABAT for short. And so NABAT is a USGS program. It's international and it's interagency, so it's huge. If you go to the website, you can see all of the maps, but it's a very large scale effort. And it's essentially designed to monitor bat distributions and abundances and to provide resource managers like myself with trend data so that we can, you know, manage these populations effectively, detect maybe early signs of population decline, stuff like that. So it's a really important effort for us to be involved with. And NABAT efforts are occurring in tandem with the white nose syndrome monitoring that I just talked about. So a central component of NABAT is acoustic monitoring using standardized methodologies. So the big thing with NA-BAT and acoustics is that we are randomly sampling these 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells across, all of North America. So we have a spatially balanced list of sampling areas within this continental grid. And so this is what it looks like in Montana. I think the green are our high priority sites, and then the blue are our second pass or lower priority sites. And so, we have been trying to hit as many of these cells as we possibly can. And this is another effort that's going to continue for, I think, the next 5 years. So bats echolocate to navigate their surroundings and find food at night. They have great eyesight. That's, one of the huge myths around bats is that they're blind. They're definitely not blind. So let's squash that myth. But they can't go outside and see. It'd be like you or I running around in the forest at full speed while also flying. So they use echolocation to see in the dark. And this means that they send out high frequency sound pulses to kind of pick up on echoes. And we have something called an acoustic bat detector. I'm holding it over here. They're not super big anymore, at least. But we couple that with a high frequency microphone. So you can see the microphone up here and right here. And essentially we leave that out and bats just fly around it, and the acoustic detector actually records them. So it's a great way to passively monitor bats. I'm a huge fan of this technology, although it does definitely have its limitations. So for NA-BAT methodologies, we would deploy 4 of these per 10 by 10 grid cell. We tried to get it 1 per quadrant, but sometimes, as you'll see in a second here, that wasn't possible. And we sort of just blitzed the entire state to sample all sorts of landscapes. So we have grassland, sagebrush steppe, forest, mountains, and even riparian areas to get a good coverage in the state. And we do not have presentable results for this large scale effort. You can go online to this particular website if you're interested. It's really cool. They built a Shiny app to kind of track a lot of these things. And so you can see where we're going with this data, but we're still in, this will be the second year of collecting data. So I'm going to share just the results of one of the sites that my husband and I sampled with you today. So this particular site is in the Beartooth Mountains, just really hard to see in this map. I apologize for that. It's kind of down here in south central Montana. And I've always, we kind of grew up in this area, and we've always been interested in where or which bats are in this just giant rocky landscape. It's just huge cliffs, high elevations. And so as you can see, these are our 4 detectors. This was a backcountry site, so it was not road accessible. And a lot of the stuff that you see, these mountains, these are up in the 10,000s of feet. So it wasn't exactly something you could do in a day and just run up and back down. So ours weren't necessarily deployed in the 4 quadrants, but this still met the methodologies. And here are the results of just 1 year of that monitoring. So in 2020, we recorded 21,803 bat echolocation sequences across these 4 detectors. Those bat echolocation sequences are brought into computers, and we run them through, automated software. And the automated software tells us which species it thinks the bat pulse is. And then a human at the Montana Natural Heritage Program has to go in and hand confirm each of these species just to validate these data. But I can say from years and years of acoustic experience that these species are probably present within this quad. So, these are just big picture results, but I think you can begin to see, just implications for learning more about bats and tracking trends over time as both white nose syndrome and wind energy continue to increase in prevalence out west. So those are just some of the projects that we're working on. I have just talked to you for almost 40 minutes about, what we're doing to help bats, but I really think it's important to point out that everyone else can, be a part of this. If you want to help bats, like I said before, one of the big things you can do is just learn more, be a bat ambassador. Another thing I always encourage people to do is put up a bat box or, agree to monitor a bat box like this one here that Ryan Rauscher put up. These can be really great for replacing any sort of lost roosting habitat. And I think, they're going to play a huge role when white nose syndrome hits the state. So also, if you have people that want to build bat boxes and just donate them to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, that's super great as well. I will take all the bat boxes. If you have bats in a building where they need to be removed because it's like a public safety concern or something like that, just make sure that you're doing it ethically. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks recommends certified companies that go in and do this in a way that isn't going to leave a bunch of dead pups in someone's house and isn't going to, impact those populations. So that's something you can definitely do. Promoting native habitat, that's really important. If you have snags on your property and they're not a hazard and they're not bothering anybody, bats might use that as well as lots of bird species. So leave those up and promote native habitat. And then I get a lot of heat for this one, but I'm going to say it anyways. Just consider keeping cats indoors. Cats kill a lot of birds and they also get a lot of bats. So that's something you can also do to help us help bats. And I think with that, I am wrapping up. I do want to say thank you to everybody at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. This has all been a massive effort. Emily Almberg, Brent Lahner, Ryan Rauscher have been huge. But it's been a lot of fun, and I hope that you all learned something. And I will stop sharing this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Shannon, this is Steve. That was a great presentation, and it just leaves me with all kinds of questions. But anyway, so you think that the adult male little brown bats are foraging and roosting at higher elevation than the females? The females are in richer habitat at lower elevations. That's kind of an interesting observation.
Yeah. And, it's really hard to say just because we didn't catch females doesn't necessarily mean they weren't there. But I can't remember, we had like 83 net nights. We were out there a lot and we just weren't catching females. And if you think about, the way bats work, especially females, when they have pups, they are lactating, and that's so energetically costly. And so they either have to use their metabolism to make up for that, or they have to be in warm areas. And so it just makes sense that they would be lower where it's a little bit warmer. There are more insects, things like that. I didn't point out that we have a species called the long-eared myotis, and that particular species, we did catch a bunch of females up high, and that particular species can glean insects off of vegetation. And so it makes sense that they can kind of be in these higher energy environments where maybe it's colder when they're lactating and things like that. But I suspect the females are down lower for sure.
So this is Steve again. I have one other observation. I feel like I don't see that many bats anymore. And the one time many years ago, I camped in a canyon in northern Wyoming, the east side of the Bighorn Mountains. And I had, at dusk, there was a hatch of insects over the creek, and there were literally tens of thousands of bats came out of, I guess, the cliffs. It's a very cliffy, cavey kind of a place. And I guess I've never really seen anything quite like that before or since. And I don't know if those animals are still there or not. And I wouldn't even know what species. I assume there were several different ones. There must be high in places like the Smith River Canyon must have a lot of bats, right?
That's what I'm told. I haven't actually floated that yet. So hopefully this next year someone will take me. But yeah, that's a very interesting observation. we've kind of been getting calls similar to like where, just we aren't seeing as many bats, where are the bats? And I guess we don't have a great answer for that. But I think there is potential for maybe, a citizen science project. There are so many people that are really excited about like putting bat houses up or monitoring bat boxes. And that's a great way to kind of, track populations over time. Whereas like those features, like you were describing, that's a lot harder. First of all, when you see something like that, it's great when you tell a biologist, because sometimes we don't know about that stuff, and they're really important features, right? So that there could be things like that in Montana. I know Gates of the Mountains, that's like an area I've always wanted to get in there and study, and it's just really difficult, right? How do you trap bats in that canyon, and how do you track bats in that canyon? So yeah, it's an interesting observation for sure.
So this is Alicia. I'm with Steve. But so what is your guess for where they are hibernating?
That's yes. We've been having, conversations about this for a while now. We have, or I guess I should say, the Montana National Heritage Program and the really cool caving group here in Montana has done a lot of work to monitor caves. And bats are using caves, but there aren't enough bats in the caves for us to say, oh yeah, this is where they all are. We're still just like, where the heck are they? So I think they're using, potentially these talus slopes. I talked about them using the crevices during the summer, but in the winter, maybe they're way deep down. If anyone's ever spent enough time on a talus slope, maybe I'm the only person that likes to do that sort of thing. But, once you start digging and like moving rocks around, it's, it can be really deep. And so our questions are like, do those talus slopes provide these like cave-like structures? And it's not like you can, stick a LiDAR in there and kind of map that talus slope, although it might be pretty expensive. We're just like, how do we study that? But I do think they're using those. There have been some, one paper out of Colorado where they were finding bats going into hibernation in that transitional season. So in between summer and winter, which suggests that maybe they're using them in the winter. But then like out in eastern Montana, Brandy Scone and Heather Harris have done a ton of work trying to track bats to their hibernacula. And, maybe like hoodoo formations is kind of what they're thinking. But again, those are cracks that just like go back and then they're just lost. There's no way really for us to physically get inside there. Sending a camera in only gets you so far. So those are kind of the features that I think they're using. And we've been talking about, different ways to get at this. Using acoustics is a great tool. But in order to have an acoustic detector out all winter, you also have to deploy a car battery, a solar panel, you have to fence it. It's like a whole thing. So it's not as easy as like, let's grid out this landscape and just put acoustic detectors everywhere. Although that's what I would like to do. So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
So it's Alicia again. So I know with the wind farms, they have ways that they try to deflect birds. And are those just not working at all for bats?
It's just, no, they're not. It's different because the birds, if you watch, it's terrible. I don't recommend this, but if you watch videos of bird collisions, they are flying through the spaces where the turbines are, and they're just getting nailed because they're trying to move through the space. Whereas if you watch videos of bats, we have infrared and UV videos of bats going up to the turbines, and it's more like they're curious because they fly up and they like circle it and do a bunch of, things around the turbine, and then they're finally struck. So it's just like different behaviorally. So the the big rings that they're putting up for birds aren't really working for bats. They were thinking for a while that UV light might keep bats away, but I don't know that's actually working. And I know USGS is putting a ton of money into trying to figure that out. There are things though, you know, I kind of am like, oh, wind energy. But in reality, if wind turbines don't cut in at those lower wind speeds, they're probably not going to hit bats. I didn't talk about the larger statewide acoustic surveillance project, but that was ongoing for, I want to say like 7 years. And one of the big things we learned from that was that at these, I guess, higher wind speeds, bats are just not active. And that's, of course, when the wind energy companies are going to be wanting to, you know, run the turbine. So if they're just not cutting in until a certain speed, I think that they can, you know, really reduce fatalities on that front. But there isn't a lot in terms of regulation. So, you know, we make recommendations, and companies in Montana have been really, really good about working with us on that front, but it's just tricky. Well, I really appreciate
Hey, Shannon, it's Brent.
Hey, Brent.
I got your email late and I just figured I'd listen in. So thanks everybody. I wasn't even gonna ask any questions, but
Oh boy. Roasted.
Yeah, one of the other folks' questions related to, or maybe it was your answer related to the talus slopes. Is that something new as far as seeing these bats utilize those slopes? I missed the first 15 minutes of your talk, but where you're seeing them use those, is that no knowledge that they're doing that, or is that something you're learning more that they're actually doing that we didn't know in the past, at least recent past?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because when I was an undergrad, I did a project on pikas, and I would like flush bats in the talus slopes. So I think it's something that people have observed, but it hasn't really been published in the West. So this is the first study that's really gone in and looked at those talus slope features in the Western US. There's the one study transition, but it's something that we're kind of, maybe people have made observations, but now we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Maybe they're also using those during the winter. So in terms of thinking about it like that and actually quantifying characteristics, this is like pretty new, I think, conversation. Although it shouldn't be, looking back, you know, it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
This is Jeremy. I just have one question. I was curious if there's any research about snowpack and winter temperature in terms of just climate change, if that's affecting bat hibernation, if they're coming out early and that makes it hard for food, or if there's even any data on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly do not know that I've seen anything specifically on snowpack. Although I wouldn't be surprised now that, you know, talus is part of the conversation that someone's looking at it. And it definitely might exist, and maybe I just don't know about it. But, you know, those are things we think about, like when we're doing these white nose syndrome monitoring efforts. And for example, going into caves where we know bats are hibernating, we really have to time it to where, you know, there's enough snow melted to where we can access the cave, but it's also late enough in the season for bats, like, you know, when we wake them up from hibernation so that they have, I guess, access to food and water, but it has to be early enough also so that there are actual bats in the cave. And so I don't know that anyone's looked at like long-term or climate change trends on that front, but it is an interesting, someone should if they haven't.
Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey Shannon, it's Cami. I have a couple questions. First one, what are the top predators of bats in Montana?
Ooh, yeah. It's funny, I was thinking about that in relation to my master's project. I think generally, definitely owls will go after bats. You know, there were at least 2 evenings where we were misnetting. One night we had to kind of pull the nets because we had a great horned owl just like camped out. And I think it thought that, you know, it would just sit there and wait for us to release bats, right? And so when you have a predator like that, you don't want to continue what you're doing. It's definitely owls, but I know that raptors will go after them during the day if they're accessible. Corvids, so like ravens, magpies, that sort of thing, if they can get to them. Definitely predators. Also weasels, skunks, snakes. Those are all species that get bats. And I think, like, you know, we're starting to have all of these conversations on bat boxes and, you know, potentially putting up these larger like bat sheds or bat condos. And one of the concerns there is if you have like a skunk or a weasel get into an entire shed full of bats, you know, that's really bad for your population versus putting up these individual bat boxes where, you know, maybe only one is accessible to a predator if they're found. But there are definitely things that go after bats in Montana.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That's like comparable to putting a kestrel box up next to your bluebird box or something, or you know, having a bluebird box and letting your cat out a lot, something like that. Yeah, thanks. Another question I had was about eDNA, and if that I don't know, can be used at all for like white nose syndrome or PD or you know, some of those factors that really affect bats.
Definitely. I think the short answer is yes. I think that eDNA is a really cool technology. And before I started the position that I'm in now, I helped the Forest Service and some other partners go out with conservation dogs. And the thought was, can we use conservation dogs to help us find roosts? And then can we also like couple that with other methods like eDNA? And so I know that MSU was trying to get something up and running on those types of methods. And like, you know, we had a lot of questions about how that would work. You know, like if you go into a cave, do you collect the soil to sample? Is there a way to collect water and air and maybe sample for not only bat species, but, you know, PD and things like that? So short answer, yes, but we don't know how to use it yet, but it's some really cool technology for sure.
Absolutely. That's great.
Yeah.
Final question, I think, is what about acoustic monitoring to maybe be able to learn or listen if bats have any like altered sound, I guess, if they're exposed to PD or experiencing symptoms of white nose syndrome. Is that a thing?
So you mean like, are their echolocation calls altered because they're sick?
Yes.
Oh, okay, interesting. I haven't read anything on that, but you know, I kind of feel guilty about not talking about the giant heritage program effort that I worked on for like 5 years, where we had acoustic detectors across the whole state for several years. And that was kind of a result of that initial 2014 white nose response plan. And we weren't looking necessarily for altered calls, but we were looking for just weird patterns of activity. So if you have an acoustic detector out in the winter, you know, you would expect bats to periodically, they'll wake up like once or twice to come out and urinate, maybe drink, but you wouldn't expect to see like big pulses. And so that's kind of what we were using acoustic technology for. You know, are there any like crazy pulses. But the problem is we don't have a baseline. So that was the baseline. So we can't really say, oh yeah, this is weird. This is a weird pulse for this area, because it was, you know, the first time it had really been studied. And so something that we've kind of been talking about with Heritage Program, and it was on my list of things to do this year and just not feasible, was to put bat detectors at known hibernacula. So maybe at the entrances of the caves that we know are getting used, and maybe that would give us some sort of baseline for those weird activity pulses. But yes, that's a really good question. Acoustics are just hard. It's hard to, I mean, that's the whole rabbit hole, but you have to like record the perfect call to even identify the species, and then to kind of track individuals, it's almost impossible, because bats use echolocation more as like a way to navigate, and not necessarily always a way to communicate like birds do. So, you know, one acoustic call kind of looks like the next one in terms of, you know, within a species. So that's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, that was excellent. Yes, thank you. Yeah, very interesting questions. You know,
Yeah.
lots of info we could learn. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited that you guys are all here tonight. I was really happy to present. So, you know, if anyone has any other additional questions, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a ring.